Alright, this article caught my eye and was basically this girl named Samantha Fulnecky was a junior in college, and her professor asked her to write a response in her psychology class to a article about gender roles and talking about how children who do not conform to gender roles may experience more teasing and how that may impact mental health, and I was just kind of examining that. Basically, the girl, Samantha Fulnecky, responded with a bunch of talking about the Bible and basically saying that gender norms must be upheld. Her teacher and the teacher's assistant or whatever both agreed to give her a 0 for this assignment. Now, the girl followed to complain to the college and said that she was being discriminated against on the basis of religion. So, kind of two things I wanted to discuss is, number one, I wanted to react to the essay itself, and number two, I wanted to discuss whether or not she should have been able to make this essay, what her grade should have been, and what should be happening with the rules for that going forward. Alright, so I'm going to read right from the top. This article was very thought-provoking and caused me to thoroughly evaluate the idea of gender and the role it plays in our society. The article discussed peers using teasing as a way to enforce gender norms. I do not necessarily see this as a problem. God made male and female and made us differently from each other on purpose and for a purpose. God is very intentional with what he makes, and I believe trying to change that would only do more harm. Gender roles and tendencies should not be considered stereotypes. Women naturally want to do womanly things because God created us with those womanly desires in our hearts. The same goes for men. God created men in the image of his courage and strength, and he created women in the image of his beauty. He intentionally created women differently than men, and we should live our lives with that in mind. Before I get into this, I just want to make the statement that I am only a senior in high school. I am not an expert on literary criticism or essay criticism or whatever, and I'm just going to be giving my opinions here on the quality of the essay for the first half of my discussion, because a lot of people were making fun of it, and I just want to talk about maybe why that might have been and what could have been done better from just like a pure essay writing standpoint, in my opinion. So we've got our classic opener. I've written openers like this, just kind of restating what the article was and how you felt about it in a very simple terms, just to kind of create the intro. It's pretty basic. Now, I do want you to note that she says, after saying teasing as a way to enforce gender norms, she says, I do not necessarily see this as a problem. This is later contradicted. I will bring that up later, just keep that in mind. The sentence about doing womanly things felt a little bit clunky, kind of repetitive, by saying womanly without really specifying what that might be. I suppose you could just interpret that based off of, what gender roles in the US look like. It just came off as a bit funny. Now, I think the issue is immediately obvious here. This is responding to a psychology research article and talking to a non-religious audience. But her main argument that's going to be coming in is basically that God says this according to the Bible, and therefore we should live like this, which obviously isn't going to connect with her audience. So I don't really see a way to reconcile this. I think fundamentally this is not an argument that's going to convince the people that she's looking to convince. Now, to be clear, the assignment wasn't explicitly meant to be an argumentative essay or anything persuasive like that. I'll read the actual assignment criteria after I finish going through the essay. I'm looking at it from a persuasive lens because that's clearly what she's going for. As we read on, we'll see that she's very clearly trying to make a point here, and so I'm going to be evaluating her based off of how well she conveys that point. Alright, I'm going to move on to the second paragraph for now. It is frustrating to me when I read articles like this and discussion posts from my classmates of so many people trying to conform to the same mundane opinion, so they do not step on other people's toes. I think that is a cowardly and insincere way to live. It is important to use the freedom of speech we have been given in this country, and I personally believe that eliminating gender in our society would be detrimental, as it pulls us further from God's original plan for humans. It is perfectly normal for kids to follow gender stereotypes because that is how God made us. The reason so many girls want to feel womanly and care for others in a motherly way is not because they feel pressured to fit into social norms. It is because God created and chose them to reflect his beauty and his compassion in that way. In Genesis, God says that it is not good for man to be alone, so he created a helper for man, which is a woman. Many people assume the word helper in this context to be condescending and offensive to women. However, the original word in Hebrew is, I'm not going to try and pronounce that, you can read the word on screen, hopefully, and that directly translates to helper equal to. Additionally, God describes himself in the Bible using the word, or helper, and he describes his Holy Spirit as our helper as well. This shows the importance God places on the role of helper, women's roles. God does not view women as less significant than men. He created us with such He created us with such intentionally and care. He made women in his image of being a helper and in the image of his beauty. If leaning into that role means I am following gender stereotypes, then I am happy to be following a stereotype that aligns with the gifts and abilities God gave me as a woman. Okay, so the just second sentence here really sticks out to me. I think that's a cowardly and insincere way to live. She's saying that other people's opinions must only be their opinions because other people have those opinions, right? They are conforming and she is not. She's the one who is speaking up for the right to free speech and other people are not, even though they are equally using free speech. And you could easily say that, she's conforming to her religion. That's a very big thing. Christianity is extremely popular, so certainly you could make the same argument that she's just conforming to the people that she was raised by who taught her these religious ideals. So it feels a bit silly to me to say that everyone who she's arguing against must just be agreeing in order to not upset people and not because that's their opinion. Like, she seems to be implying that everyone secretly agrees with her and we're just too afraid to say it, which is not true. While I obviously find it hard to understand her religious arguments that she brought up in the first paragraph, this is where it really lost me, in the sense that she's just kind of making this up, and as somebody who may disagree with her opinion, this has already put me off. Okay, and here's the first seeming contradiction that she's made. She says it's perfectly normal for kids to follow gender stereotypes, and that people don't follow these gender norms because they feel pressure to, but because that is their natural way of being. And yet earlier she said, the article discussed peers using teasing as a way to enforce gender norms. I do not necessarily see this as a problem. So in her earlier statement, she was suggesting that this is a phenomenon that exists. She just didn't see it as a problem because it was a way to uphold the gender norms that God intended. But now she is arguing against the idea that social pressures are a factor at all, and is claiming that this is just how people are naturally, and that we should let it be, rather than uphold it actively. Now she moves on to this whole thing about being God's helper and how God values that role equally to the men's role. I'm not going to comment too much on the validity of that argument because I haven't read the Bible myself. I am not super informed about that topic. Obviously, I'm coming from the point of view that designating specific roles to people and saying you must absolutely conform to this, or else that is wrong in the eyes of God. I am not coming from that perspective. I don't think that perspective is helpful to people, but obviously that is in direct conflict with her viewpoint. And again, bringing up the point that it's just going to be very difficult to convince me of this because it's just so radically different from what I believe and what I think her teacher probably believed and her fellow students that she was complaining about. I cannot comment on whether or not the Bible says that women are equal to men, but I can comment on how these kinds of terms have been used, right? Regardless of if your interpretation of the Bible is all fine and dandy, the truth is that other people historically have not used it that way. People have used words from the Bible to put down women and say that they have to serve men, essentially. So even if your interpretation doesn't say that, the fact remains that by upholding gender norms, you are also upholding that history of using gender norms specifically to put down women. I do have to mention this little error that she made, which I would say speaks to the lack of intentionality that she put into this essay. I think as a junior in college, she could have easily caught that had she done a little bit of proofreading beforehand, which I assume that she didn't based off of this mistake. Samantha later mentioned that she had always gotten hundreds in this class and they never had a problem with her grammar or writing style. Perhaps that's true, but if it is, I'm a bit concerned that she's in college and they don't care about that. I don't know what the colleges look like in Oklahoma. I do not live near Oklahoma, but I would hope the standard is a bit better than this, considering as a high schooler, you would definitely have that mistake pointed out to you. In my school, at least. And again, she just says that I am okay with following gender stereotypes, which obviously she doesn't see as stereotypes, because that is the way of God. In my opinion, this also represents her mindset here, in that she sees herself as a real rebellious kind of person, right? She's defying what society is demanding in this new liberal hellscape. And again, still doesn't really address the problem of forcing gender roles onto others, which is kind of what the original study was touching on by talking about teasing behavior in children, towards children who do not conform to societal ideals of gender. This is just kind of talking about her personally, and I'm not upset that she wants to follow gender stereotypes. If that's what makes her happy, that's not my business. But the issue is when she calls other people out as wrong in some way for not following the same beliefs. The snarkiness here kind of shows how she believes that she's really defying expectations by acting as a woman should, according to Christian beliefs. However, aside from some really hardcore feminists, I guess, nobody's really saying you can't do that. I don't care. I just care when you apply the standards to everyone else. Alright, I'm finally moving on to the third paragraph. I do not think men and women are pressured to be more masculine or feminine. I strongly disagree with the idea that from the article that encouraging acceptance of diverse gender expressions could improve students' confidence. Society pushing the lie that there are multiple genders and everyone should be whatever they want to be is demonic and severely harms American youth. I do not want kids to be teased or bullied in school. However, pushing the lie that everyone has their own truth and everyone can do whatever they want and be whoever they want is not biblical whatsoever. The Bible says that our lives are not our own, but that our lives and bodies belong to the Lord for His glory. I live my life based on this truth and firmly believe that there would be less gender issues and insecurities in children if they were raised knowing they do not belong to themselves, but they belong to the Lord. And while it's fine that she personally disagrees that encouraging diverse gender expression would be good, it's really funny how she responds to this, again, research paper, scientific research, right? And by just saying, nuh-uh, that's basically what she does. Nuh-uh, but also the Bible, which just isn't a good response. I suppose it's a good response if you're already working from a Christian framework. I don't think it's really appropriate for the type of evidence that was being brought up. They weren't arguing from a religious point of view because they're working from entirely different frameworks. She's kind of playing a losing game here. I wanted to mention one other thing that, again, people were kind of mocking, but to me it really just shows that there was a lack of proofreading here. She says, pushing the lie that there are multiple genders, except for the fact that two genders would be multiple genders, so this would imply that there's only one, but clearly she's not trying to say that. She's trying to say there's two. Again, just saying it is demonic and severely harms American youth. Nothing backing that up, because again, this is not a research-based response, responding to research. This is just an opinion, I guess. Which, again, in fairness, the assignment didn't say it had to be evidence-backed, but it does feel a bit silly. And onto the second contradiction she makes. I do not want kids to be teased or bullied in school, whereas, again, at the beginning, in the first paragraph, she said she didn't see it as a problem to use teasing as a way to enforce gender norms. Blah, 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 this is not biblical, which again, to anyone reading this who isn't already mostly on board with her beliefs, that doesn't really matter. I don't know who she's trying to make convincing. I suppose you could say that she just wanted to express herself, but in that case, I think she could have gone for a different angle. This feels like she's trying to convince me, but like doing so really poorly. I'm gonna assume that she thinks there would be less gender issues and insecurities in children if they were raised with biblical teachings, because then they would have an exact formula and they would, I guess, feel more secure or something instead of being left to decide for themselves. And there's a certain certainty in that. I'm just totally extrapolating here. I could be wrong, but that's because she doesn't really expand on this point. Obviously, this kind of ignores the entire point of the research article she was responding to that was talking about teasing and stuff, and the fact that, nobody's going to live up to these things perfectly, and that in of itself is going to cause insecurity. She doesn't really address this at all. She just kind of says, but I believe this, which is fine, I guess. It just isn't a very good response. She concludes, overall, reading articles such as this one encourage me to one day raise my children, knowing that they have a heavenly Father who loves them and cherishes them deeply, and that having their identity firmly rooted in who He is will give them the satisfaction and acceptance that the world can never provide for them. My prayer for the world, and specifically for American society and youth, is that they would not believe the lies being spread from Satan that make them believe that they are better off as another gender than what God made them. I pray that they feel God's love and acceptance as who He originally created them to be. I do find the first sentence to be a bit of a run-on. I believe that there should have been a comma before the "and that having their identity firmly rooted in who He is will give them satisfaction and acceptance. The world can never provide for them." Overall, it's just a very long sentence, which isn't necessarily bad, but it feels a little clunky to me. And then, of course, she brings up the trans issue. I could not find the original research paper in full. I don't believe it was talking about that. I could only find the abstract, though, so forgive me if I'm incorrect. However, I believe that she just kind of brought that up because clearly that's an issue that she cares about. And I do suppose that it has relation to the original topic, even if it wasn't directly a part of the research. Alright, so conclusion, this essay has numerous contradictions, probably wasn't proofread, a few grammar errors here and there, from my understanding. Again, please correct me if I am wrong about grammar. I am not an expert on grammar. And overall, just kind of poorly constructed. I get what she was trying to do in terms of bringing her personal perspective into the mix, which again was a part of the assignment. However, to me, this just kind of feels like if I showed up to like a religious-based group and they were asking questions about the Bible, and in my response I just said, well, the Bible is totally made up and I don't believe this. That would be, off topic and inappropriate, and it would be like, why are you here if you don't want to argue based off of this framework, right? So if you're not going to engage with the material respectfully and like in a way that is relevant, that's kind of on you. I don't think that's really super appropriate. However, in her defense, the rubric did not explicitly state that, but it's kind of common sense in my opinion. If you're taking psychology, which is a science, if you're taking a psychology class, you'd be expected to respond to research with opinions that are at least somewhat backed up by research. And again, this isn't me discriminating against her. I don't care if she has those beliefs, but it's just not relevant to the class. If you're not going to engage with science on a scientific basis, then you can't expect to have a good grade. Also, I'd love to hear like a Christian's perspective who maybe doesn't hold the exact same beliefs as her, but does believe in God and, Christian stuff like that, because she doesn't really cite the Bible at all. I'm assuming she had time to write this, and she didn't actually directly quote the Bible. She didn't directly quote any important religious figure or, speaker. She just was kind of paraphrasing, right? Which I don't think is very good strategy, even if you're just trying to convince other Christians. I don't think Christians would appreciate this because it's not even a good discussion about the Bible. But if anyone in the comments has an opinion about that, then feel free to tell me. But anyways, next I will discuss what was directly stated by the rubric and give my opinion about how well it followed that specific rubric and what should have been done given that information alone. I will read the rubric itself. According to this article, again, I'm not a journalist. I don't know if this is correct. Please correct me if I am wrong. I am a random high schooler who found this article interesting. Anyways, I will read that out now, and after that I will read out the teacher's comments for what they found wrong with the essay. You must write a 650 words, double-spaced reaction paper demonstrating that you read the assigned article and include a thoughtful reaction to the material presented in the article. Points will be deducted when papers are deficient in any of those areas. I'll deduct 10 points in your paper if your paper is between 620 and 649 words, and I will not give credit for paper under 620 words. Papers not turned in by the deadline will not receive credit. Please remember that your reaction paper should not be a summary, but rather a thoughtful discussion of some aspect of the article. Okay, so far I would say she's kind of fine. The only thing I would maybe deduct points for is thoughtful reaction. Again, I don't think this was proofread, so in that sense it was not thoughtful. However, it was not merely a summary of the original research, and I guess you could say it was reaction, certainly. The criteria continue to say, possible approaches to reaction papers include 1. A discussion of why you feel the topic is important and worthy of study or not. 2. An application of the study or results to your own experiences. 3. An application of the study or results to observations about other behaviors. 4. Linking the objectives or findings from the assigned article to other domains of development or other findings that we read about or discuss in class. 5. A suggestion for further studies or experiments that might help researchers better understand the topic being studied. 6. Alternate interpretations of the researcher's findings. 7. A discussion of how development in this domain might proceed differently at other developmental stages. 8. Your own thoughts about how development proceeds in the domain being researched in the article. So, was she doing any of these things? And keep in mind that it does say there are other possibilities as well, so technically she doesn't have to appeal to any of these specific things, but I will go over them anyways. For number 1, I would say no. She does kind of talk about the importance in terms of enforcing gender rules is important because that's what God says, but worthy of study, again, this is completely devoid of any mention of research. This is not about scientific literature or anything like that. You could potentially say that she was going for answering number 2 in the sense that it's more her own beliefs, not so much her own experiences, right? She wasn't, although she did touch on her experiences, right? She's like, I wasn't bullied into being a woman. I am a woman, or whatever, biblically. So I guess you would say that she was appealing to number 2. For number 3, no. 4, no, I would also say no. 5, no, because again, she's not talking about research. She doesn't care about research. This is about religion. 6, you could maybe argue that she's saying in the sense that she's giving the alternate interpretation of no, I actually don't think that people follow gender rules because of peer pressure or whatever, except that's kind of just refuting the research without making any point backing that up besides the Bible. So, sort of. 7, no. And 8, no. She seems to have used 12-point Times New Roman with 1-inch margins on all sides, and then it just says graded on a 25-point scale, of which, again, she got 0 of the points, and are evaluated based on the following: 10 points for does the paper show a clear tie-in to the assigned article, another 10 points for does the paper present a thoughtful reaction or response to the article rather than a summary, and 5 points for is the paper clearly written. Now, if I were the one grading her, according to this rubric, I would not be giving her 0 points, in my opinion. As much as I do not like what she was saying and think that her essay was really bad, I wouldn't take off all the points because she does do some of these things. The paper is clearly tied into the article, even if it's a poor response to it. The paper doesn't provide a thoughtful reaction, in my opinion, but it doesn't summarize either, so I would give partial credit for that point. And is the paper clearly written? Again, probably not. I don't think it was proofread, and she clearly contradicts herself, so that's also pretty unclear. I would say very few points for that category. Now, the whole reason that this became a thing, right, is obviously the student was saying, you're discriminating against me for my religion, that's why you gave me a 0, not because I actually did the assignment wrong. And there's this also kind of unspoken thing where the teaching assistant was transgender, and therefore the idea is that she is biased because the student in question pointed out transgender people and basically said that the idea of being transgender and the acceptance of that is satanic. For this reason, I believe the teacher was actually temporarily put on leave or something while this issue was being investigated. Now again, in my opinion, I would not have given her a 0 if we're just purely basing this off of the rubric and nothing about the general appropriateness of responding with a religious-based essay to a psychology class that is, scientific in nature. Now, what did the teacher say for her reasoning for why she deducted points? Well, first of all, she did claim that this was not having anything to do with certain beliefs, which obviously we can't prove or disprove because that would be within the teacher's head. Moving on, the teacher said the essay lacked empirical evidence, which is true. Now, if you want to apply a very letter-of-the-law philosophy, you could say, well, the rubric did not say that I had to include empirical evidence, and in fact, that is what was being argued here, in part. Which is true, but again, in my opinion, it's pretty obvious that you should be using actual research-based evidence when you're talking about research in a science class. But yes, you could give the benefit of the doubt in this situation. Now, the big kicker here, and what everyone was talking about, is the teacher also said that the essay was, at times, offensive, which could signify that the teacher was merely disagreeing with the student's beliefs, but could also be in reference to the student's presentation of said beliefs, as it was stated in a very insulting manner. Now, is this justified at all? Obviously, there will be people who say, no, of course not, this is about free speech, and personal beliefs should be respected, and the student should have been allowed to say this with no consequence. But it is also important to create a proper environment at school, and that means creating some guidelines around the expectations for how things are expressed and what is expressed and when. And I fully understand that this is a difficult balance to strike because you obviously also want to respect student opinion as well. But I think it's pretty plain to see why it could be seen as disruptive to the class to be insulting transgender people on a essay that was not supposed to be about transgender people, and in a class that is science-based, and your response is purely religious-based. Well, maybe technically the rubric allows this. Surely you can see how this is not productive and not relevant to the assignment that was given. And the teacher's feelings do matter here, because it is important that teachers are respected in the school environment, and being called demonic, I think is fair to say it does not fit within that definition. If I receive this essay, I would think there needs to be a major discussion in the future about what is appropriate and respectful for the class and what is relevant to the class, and make that much clearer. Not that I actually believe the student was completely unaware here. Of course they weren't. This is highly likely to be an orchestrated plan to get media attention towards this student's cause. However, I suggest the point about clarifying the rules just so that nobody will be able to deny if you had written it more clearly. Again, I think it should have been obvious not to write this kind of essay in a science class with your teacher being a part of the minority who you are attacking. But, plausible deniability and all that. And the teacher basically reiterates the same points that I made Wait, now it sounds like I'm just copying the teacher's points. I swear I came up with that before I read these statements. Anyways, the teacher went on to say, I am deducting points because you posted a reaction paper that does not answer the questions for this assignment, contradicts itself, heavily uses personal ideology over empirical evidence in a scientific class, and is at times offensive. So that was the full quote. It was not just at times offensive. Furthermore, the teacher said, while you are entitled to your own personal beliefs, there is an appropriate time or place to implement them in your reflections. I encourage all students to question or challenge the course material with other empirical findings or testable hypotheses, but using your own personal beliefs to argue against the findings of not only this article, but the findings of countless articles across psychology, biology, sociology, etc., is not best practice, all of which I agree with. She also said, this isn't a vague narrative of society pushes lies, but instead the result of countless years developing psychological and scientific evidence for these claims and directly interacting with the communities involved. You may personally disagree with this, but that doesn't change the fact that every major psychological, medical, pediatric, and psychiatric association in the U.S. acknowledges that biologically and psychologically, sex and gender is neither binary nor fixed. Right, if you want to disagree with that in a psychology class, then at least use other research. I'm sure you could find it. I really don't see this as any kind of religious persecution, but rather an attempt to maintain the focus of the class and provide basic respect to the teacher. I find that a lot of people are very quick to jump to saying, I'm being cancelled, or I am losing my right to free speech, when in fact they have not lost any right to free speech. They are just getting consequences for saying things that aren't really appropriate for the situation and could be considered discriminatory. I do understand that, especially with the rise of the internet and subsequent increase in that kind of herd mentality, extreme behavior, that some things do get out of proportion and that people get hurt, and I agree with that, but I do not think that this was an example of that. And because those situations have existed, it's very easy for someone like this to weaponize that, to just avoid consequences, essentially, for their hateful and kind of nonsensical comments. As a result, I'm kind of disappointed that the college sided with the student here. Again, you could say the student gets a pass here because of the rubric. Again, a very letter of the law mentality. But I just am not gonna pretend that I'm totally happy with the outcome here. Certain political groups immediately swooped in to make this into a case of religious discrimination. Again, I've clearly laid out why I don't see it as such. And again, this is posed as a defense of free speech, when in reality I think it's plain to see that they just want an excuse to fire a trans teacher who admittedly might have had her personal feelings involved in her grading of this assignment. While I might have been more willing to provide benefit of the doubt in this situation, I do not think that the student was completely innocent, and I do not think that she lost her amendment rights in any way. She was simply not given the grade she wanted. And might I add, for all the conversation about how certain liberal people, and particularly liberal minorities talking about minority issues, being told that they are expressing their opinions in a way that is presumptuous or offensive to other people, particularly majority groups, this doesn't get any fanfare. This is fine, I guess, despite being completely unscientific and insulting.